thanks for joining me for part three of this series where we're going through the story of Jesus walking on water, and we see at first we see the his disciples, panicking because there's another storm. And then when they see Jesus, it's almost like at least Peter, at the very least, we can see where he begins to um, have a peace, and we see him start to walk um, out onto the water. Now, that was part two. Part three, I kind of want to spend time, you know, diving into what was going on in Peter's mind when he saw Jesus, and when he said, "Is if that is you, call out to me, and I will um, walk out to you." Because we find the majority of the time, Peter puts his foot in his mouth many times. And one of the ways that you can put your foot in your mouth is by being ignorant. Now, it doesn't say that Peter was being ignorant. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that Peter was putting his foot in his mouth. It doesn't say um, that he was being ignorant, but we can see often that Peter puts his foot in his mouth in the things that he says often. And so, just going off of that, you kind of get the thought, and again, it doesn't say this in scripture, but you kind of get the thought that maybe there was a moment when Peter was had like a ignorant, well, if that's you, tell me to walk on, like now we don't know. I'm not saying that he did, but isn't that because think about this. How often do you have, multiple thoughts in your mind? How often do we as humans go, well, I want to do this, but I don't want to do this. I want to get this. I don't want to get this. How often times do we have thoughts of being ignorant, but also thoughts of you know you know being humble, and we just gotta choose. Are we going to act out in humbleness, or are we going to act out in being ignorant? And so that's my point here, is oftentimes as humans we can kind of have almost a double mindedness about us, like, well, we're a little bit ignorant, but we can choose to be humble if we wanted to, or we're, you know, we just have that. And so that's the thought that was going on in my mind, was maybe perhaps Peter was, a little 50-50, kind of, ignorant, because that is one of the ways that you can put your foot in your mouth often, is through ignorance. And so maybe um there was a moment where Peter was maybe, perhaps somewhat ignorant, um but then maybe he also chose to be humble instead of ignorant. Is where I'm going with this, because oftentimes we can have these, you know half and half thoughts, where we want to choose to be ignorant, but we choose to be humble instead. And so that's what I'm saying, is even though it doesn't say that in Scripture, that's an interesting thought. That maybe at the beginning, Peter might have had an ignorant thought that maybe he, instead of choosing ignorance, he chooses to be humble. And we see him ask, if that's you, let me walk, step out and come to you. And so you see where maybe he chose to be humble over being ignorant. And that's just an interesting thought that I had. Now another interesting thought is what were, you know and because we can see that Peter probably has the gift of faith, where he because like the gift of faith, you're like, yeah, let's do this. That's the gift of faith. The gift of faith is like, yes, I let's totally, trust the Lord. And so you can kind of see, not only is there times when Peter puts his foot in his mouth, but there are times where he shows that he has more faith than the other disciples. And so maybe perhaps Peter has the gift of faith, and maybe it's not that the other disciples were not wanting to step out of the water or onto the water, um, but maybe they don't quite have the gift of faith. And a good example would be Thomas. Um, remember where Thomas had to feel Jesus to see, like he literally had to feel the hands of Jesus and things like that to to really see that it was Jesus that was resurrected, and talking to him. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about is, maybe perhaps the other disciples needed to see Peter walking on the water. Now it's interesting though, because um you do have to remember they never stepped out of that boat. So you kind of go, maybe they were waiting to see Peter step out on the water, or maybe not, like we don't really know. Or maybe they saw Peter get out, walk on the water, and maybe perhaps in their hearts they were about to, until they saw him sink, and then they changed their minds. Like, we don't really know exactly, but it could also be that they didn't really feel like they really needed to. Maybe they felt, comfortable. Like, well, I'm comfortable staying. Like, not that I don't trust the Lord, it's just I'm comfortable, staying in this boat. I know that the person walking on water is Jesus. So maybe they, you know, went from panic to having peace because they could see that it was Jesus, but maybe they were comfortable staying in the boat, being like, well, that's Jesus out there. I don't need to prove that I have faith. Well, which is another, sermon, because that's a silly thing to say is, well, I don't really need to prove that I have faith. Well, which you don't really need to prove anyway, but you whenever God, tests your faith, you should be obedient and step out. So it could be them thinking, well, I don't really need to prove, but I doubt that. I very highly doubt that, because I do believe that it's probably Jesus, testing the disciples. And so, but you can definitely see how the other disciples, were probably like, I'm gonna be comfortable staying in this boat.